Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Sarah Bauer. She's a developmental pediatrician. Today's Kevin MD article is Diabetes and Liver Disease, Urgent Screening Needs Highlighted by Personal Tragedy. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
So let's start by briefly sharing your story and journey.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm a developmental behavioral pediatrician, and this story started with my dad. So my dad was diagnosed with stage 4 hepatocellular carcinoma on March 14th, 2023, and he died on May 12th, 2023. And so to be sure, I come to this first as a daughter who happens to be a physician. And so I think that I'm certainly not a liver expert or a cancer expert, but I think what we learned throughout his journey is important. And I think that to honor and to share his story and to put humanity and voice to the data and the guidelines is important.
All right. So tell us about his story and what you went through.
Sure. So, as I mentioned, his from diagnosis to his death was very quick. And so I think that our family and my father had a crash course in the medical system. We also had a crash course in understanding what some end organ complications are with diabetes. And so I think that throughout the process, my father never asked why it happened to him, but he asked how. And I think that how centered on the fact that he did everything that he thought he was supposed to do. So he regularly followed with his primary care physician. His primary care physician followed all of the guidelines as put out by the American Diabetes Association. And I looked at that throughout, and I also throughout his journey, but I also looked at it later, right? And then afterwards, I would say June 25th, 2023, my cousin shared an updated guideline with me from the American Diabetes Association. And at that point, which was too late for my dad, but hopefully not for other people, they had updated the guidelines on screening for liver disease, specifically non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And this is how this article all came together.
All right. So tell us about this article. It's titled Diabetes and Liver Disease, Urgent Screening Needs Highlighted by Personal Tragedy. For those who didn't get a chance to read this article, tell us what it's about.
Sure. So the article is literally about my dad's story. And so I think his journey started in December of 2022. And so at that point, he was with his annual visit with his doctor. His doctor checked liver function tests as recommended, and there was a mildly elevated AST. My father was not having any symptoms at the time, but through the diligence of his primary care doctor, he followed that up. And I actually looked at that and talked with him later about it, his doctor. And I often thought that could have been something that could been easily overlooked, right? You could have said, sometimes it gets elevated. It's not a big deal, but he was diligent. He followed up on it. And after that, it led to he screened for autoimmune hepatitis, Hep B, Hep C. He had him stop all supplements that he was taking at the time. Then from that, the liver numbers kept going up. And so his AST, then his ALT, throughout it, his bilirubin, everything, that piece was the same. And then there was a liver ultrasound, which showed multiple nodules in his liver, a CAT scan, a liver biopsy, and that's how it all came to be diagnosed.
So for those who aren't familiar with that connection between liver disease and diabetes, because whenever you think about diabetes, liver disease isn't often the first thing that comes to mind. And you did mention a few diseases that were connected, like non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So what are some other liver conditions that people with diabetes are at risk for?
Sure. So this is where I would say I'm not an expert in this, right? So I think as a developmental pediatrician, I would probably refer to my adult medicine colleagues for that. I think I can speak to some of the end organ complications that he was screened for that are part of those American Diabetes Association guidelines. So his eyes were checked on a yearly basis. His kidneys were checked on a yearly basis, or a more frequent basis sometimes. Cardiovascular risks were assessed. A1C was assessed, and those were all within, he didn't have those complications. And so I think that when you look at what the screening guidelines are, and even if you look at the the guidelines from the American Diabetes Association, there's a lot of opportunity for interpretation, right? And there's a lot of opportunity for how to implement. Yes, liver disease is an end organ complication of diabetes, but how do we screen for that? And I think my dad went straight from, being a healthy, active person to having stage 4 liver cancer. And I think it gets to the insidious nature of liver cancer in and of itself. So I think, there's a lot of unknowns with his story as well.
And in terms of the American Diabetes Association guidelines, what are their recommendations when it comes to screening for anything related to liver? Is it just simple liver function tests? Do they require anything more? What are their general guidelines?
Yeah, so from my interpretation of it, it says look at liver function tests, right? And so those are to be checked on an annual basis. And correct me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but I think it says to look at that. And they were. And that first indication was that mildly elevated AST.
So tell us about the medical journey and his interactions with the healthcare system. And speaking as a physician, I guess on the other side, from the family side, what was that experience like for you?
It was incredibly difficult. I'll be honest with you. I think that his primary care doctor was definitely a trusted colleague, a trusted source of information, and he was with us and supporting my family and my dad up until when my dad died. So my dad died while we were on a long anticipated vacation to South Carolina. So we ended up having to leave pretty quickly because he wanted to go. It was approved that he should go by his physician team, but then when we got down there, it was very evident that we needed to leave, and he was declining very rapidly, and we didn't make it home. And I think that throughout that process, we interacted with also healthcare teams that we had never encountered before, and actually had Googled a trauma center, and that's how we ended up where we did. And I can't speak highly enough to that team that we worked with in South Carolina, and how they supported my dad, how they were compassionate and kind. I think where I found it difficult, where my dad found it difficult, where my mom, who was there with him throughout the whole journey, was it's overwhelming, right?
Yeah.
To be given all this information, even as a physician, you're rapidly taking notes. It's out of my area of expertise. I'm trying to help them. They're trying to face questions of their own mortality when they were living their lives and
Yeah.
enjoying them days before, right? So I think that it's very difficult. It's very humbling, but it's also one where, my dad had a first opinion. He had a second opinion that his primary care doctor also encouraged him to get, which I think was wonderful. I think as a physician myself, I was able to navigate that easier for them
Sure.
than I can't imagine what it's like to navigate those systems without that expertise or knowledge.
So, as a physician, what specifically did you do to help navigate that situation? Because as you know, I'm a physician myself, and
Mhm.
sometimes a lot of the things that we tell patients to do or order for patients and referrals, we actually don't know ourselves. So, as a
Right.
physician yourself, like what are some specific things that you did that you felt helped navigate the situation for your parents?
So I immediately called one of my attendings from medical school, and he was referred to me by one of my colleagues as well, who's a friend from medical school as well. And I called him and I said, "This is the situation. We need help," and he helped us know who to call, right? Like, who is the hepatocellular carcinoma experts in our area? How do we make sure all the slides and all of that gets taken care of and gets to the right place? And so he helped point us in the direction, I think, in the direction that we needed. And I think that fell a lot on, I think my parents were like, listen, we need help, and my parents are, very savvy people that were able to navigate things by themselves, and so for them to ask help, I think the role switch happened quickly, and that was also something that was a lesson and also very humbling, and you take it very seriously, right? Like, you want to help your family. And I think where, looking back, and this is hindsight is 2020, right? you know I wasn't delusional that stage 4 hepatocellular carcinoma was not a is a terminal diagnosis, right? I think my dad knew that too. My mom knew that. But I think what didn't happen, and I don't think anybody could have predicted, was how quickly he declined.
Mm.
And I think that, I mean, it was it was in rapid speed. And I think that I look at it and I wonder, gosh, would the conversation about palliation, should have that happened sooner rather than later? It was a passing word that we
Mhm.
learned about when we got down to South Carolina. And it's not that we didn't think about it, but my dad wanted to fight it. He wanted to
Sure.
stabilize the tumor growth and he wanted to live, you know? And so I think that that's something that I look back on and I wonder if that conversation should have just been put out there, even if he decided that's not what I want right now.
So, of course, there are so many patients with diabetes. So, what kind of messages can they learn from hearing your story and the story of your father?
Mm. That's a great question, Kevin. I think that a lot of our learning, my learning was in retrospect, right? So it was after the fact. And so after my dad died, we came back home and I quickly reached out to his oncologist after it had all, after things had settled down a little bit and just asked, like, what organizations do you recommend connecting with? And that's where I encountered and became part of, like, as a caregiver, right, as a
Yeah.
family member, a liver cancer community as part of Blue Fairy. So BLUEFAERY, which is a great organization. And it's founded primarily, for those of you who don't know, to prevent, to fight, to cure, to treat primary hepatocellular carcinoma. And that organization has been a wealth of support for caregivers, but also learning the stories of other people who went through liver cancer. And so I think when it comes to, I had a lot of questions like, did you, did, you know, did you have diabetes? Like, how was your journey with, what were your risk factors, things like that. And so I think what I learned was that this conversation just needs to happen. So if you have
Mhm.
diabetes, you need to talk to your doctor, right? Like, liver disease is an end organ complication. So what are we doing about it? And I think also, as I think about lessons for clinicians too, right? It's hard to separate those
Of
roles. Like,
course. Yeah.
what would I want to know, right? And I think that as a physician, I think it's one of these things where you'd want to say, like, this is the opportunity to participate in national meetings, international meetings, committees, right? Where they're providing more specificity and clarity to what those liver disease screenings should be, because LFTs are, it's not sufficient,
Yeah.
right? So, but also doing every 6 month ultrasounds with an AFP is not feasible for every single patient with diabetes, right? So, how do we address that as a healthcare community? I think is another opportunity.
So, as you reflect on this experience, and it's been I know it's very difficult for you to share. So, thank you so much for sharing that story. How did it affect you professionally as a physician? Has it changed anything that you did when you see patients in the exam room?
A great question. I think it's changed. I think everyone who's gone through, I mean, this is a universal human condition, right, of loss and grief. And I think it affects you in very unexpected ways. And I did not anticipate the way it would affect my role as a physician. And so, in the world that I live in, I'm talking with families about their children, right? So, their heart, their everything, in terms of when development happens in a different way, or when their expectations and dreams for their children happen in different ways. How does that's also a form of grief and loss, right? And
Yeah.
so the conversation was really centered about how am I in those interactions, and it absolutely changed me. I think initially I found it very hard to be in those conversations, to be very honest.
Mm.
And I think it's also changed the way I want to focus my career. So I think right now it's really focused on education and talking and holding space for students and residents and fellows as they go through their training and have to have these difficult conversations with families over time. It's part of the most important thing I think we do as physicians, which is walking with people through times of uncertainty. And I think that that's a lesson that I learned, and I think it's changed me forever. And so, in a lot of ways, you know, of course, I would never want this to happen to my dad, but I think, he's absolutely still here with us. And I think he's absolutely, that relationship just changes, at least kind of how I believe it. It changes. It doesn't end, it changes. And I think that's how he's continued to live on through myself and my family and all of those friends who love him.
We're on to Sarah Bauer. She's a developmental behavioral pediatrician. Today's Kevin MD article is Diabetes and Liver Disease, Urgent Screening Needs Highlighted by Personal Tragedy. Sarah will end with some of your take home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think the take home messages is that, I think if you have diabetes, talk to your physician, right? Talk to your physician about those end organ complications. Make sure you're keeping up with the guidelines. And also, if more specific screening is needed, what does your doctor recommend? I think asking questions is critical. I think connecting with broader communities, right? Like when you've been diagnosed with a disease, it can be very isolating and those fears can be very debilitating. So I think places like the American Liver Foundation, Blue Fairy, those are wonderful places to connect with. And I think also for clinicians, there's patient education resources on there that can also be very supportive. And with that, I think also for clinicians, I think remembering that in the midst of the challenging healthcare landscape that
Mhm.
we dwell in right now, we're still humans helping humans and trying to support them in their journeys of uncertainty. And I think allowing those processes to help us develop more and to be more evolved humans, I think is also critical. So thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your story, perspective, and insight. Thanks again for coming on the show.